The distant drone of an RAF bomber's engine could be made out on a moonless January 1944 night in the southeast French area of Haute-Savoie. Out of nowhere, 3 commandos jumped out of the plane and gently descended to the ground. At the drop zone, the 3 were met by a small group of French resistance fighters who promptly whisked them away to safety. The trio consisted of a British agent, a French radio operator, and an American captain. The captain, who served in the US Marines, was on a clandestine mission with the OSS, the agency that would later transform into the CIA in the United States. Aiming to gauge the French resistance's fighting prowess in the regions of Savoy, Isère and Drôme, the operation was codenamed Union. There was no doubt that the group was exceptional. The Maquis, or French underground, regarded the Frenchman, whose name was Monnier, as their top communications guy. The Englishman on the operation, HHA Thackwait, was the antithesis of a spy. Upon the outbreak of hostilities between Great Britain and Germany, he offered his services to British intelligence, despite his background as a schoolmaster. Peter Ortiz, a US Marine officer, American, remained as the group's final member. Even before America got involved in the war, Ortiz had established himself as a household name. This courageous captain had previously escaped from a German prison camp while serving in the French Foreign Legion. He eventually arrived in America and joined the Marine Corps. After the Marines noticed his skills and knowledge of the Germans, they made him an officer without hesitation. In his fight against the Nazis in Europe, he was among the small number of Marines who collaborated with the OSS. When one thinks about the Marines' Wat-2 involvement, mental pictures of infantry troops charging the Pacific beaches of Guadalcanal, Tarawa and Iwo Jima pop into one's head. Though they were limited in number, the Leathernecks were just as important in the European theatre. The Office of the Coordination of Information, COI, became the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, when World War II broke out. The flamboyant William J. Donovan, an honourably decorated Watututu veteran, was in charge of it. The British Secret Intelligence Services, SIS, asked Donovan to see their operations before the war. No other American had ever been permitted to witness the equipment and procedures that he saw. He gained a fresh perspective on the proper structure and operation of an intelligence gathering unit. His proposal for an entity to report directly to the President of the United States on all intelligence problems outside the bounds of the United States was endorsed by Roosevelt, and the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, came into being as a result of his message to the President. People from all walks of life, including the military, were invited to join the OSS. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, dispatched 35 Marine officers and a considerable number of enlisted Marines to conduct covert operations across Africa and Europe. In order to bolster the French resistance, the OSS increased its covert missions into France before the Normandy invasion. The Haute-Savoie was one region that the Allies were keeping a careful eye on. An intimidating-looking stronghold of 30 miles in length and 12 miles in width, the Vercors plateau rose 3,000 feet above sea level. This once rugged landscape is now famous for its chic ski areas. Nearby Grenoble sits the stunning Notre Dame Cathedral. However, Frenchmen went to Haute-Savoie during World War II not for prayer but for battle. Collaborating with the Germans, the Vichy government had started to pick up all able-bodied men aged 20 and up to be sent to Germany to labor in military factories. As many as tens of thousands took flight, most heading south in search of the underground. The Maquis were their given moniker, after a dense thicket that grows unchecked in Corsica. The rebel warriors had it rough. The men who come to fight live in perilous fashion, with food being hard to get, as stated in one leaflet. They won't be able to communicate with anyone. Their families will be completely cut off from them. The enemy won't treat them fairly. They won't be paid, and they can't even write to each other. The increasing number of Maquis did not alleviate the Allies' worries about the Maquis' combat prowess, or the difficulty of providing them. That is why Operation Union came to be. The mission to assess the Maquis was to be carried out by Thackwait, Monnier, and Ortiz via parachute into France. Major Robert E. Mattingly stated in his book, Herringbone Cloak, GI Dagger, Marines of the OSS, Union had a clear task: identify the military capability of Maquis groups. Its mission statement stressed that these units' commanders should take heart in the fact that their primary responsibility has shifted to coordinating guerrilla operations, particularly in the aftermath of D-Day. The members of the tiny band had jumped in civilian attire, but they still carried their military uniforms with them. This made them the first uniformed officers from the Allies to make an appearance in France since 1940. There were moments when this was problematic, unfortunately. Ortiz would wear his Marine uniform with pride both in town and in the surrounding countryside. He detested the Nazis. Despite widespread acclaim from French citizens, the three agents became the target of persistent German attempts at capture. The vibrant Ortiz was seated in a cafe on a gloomy evening. Over at another table, a number of German commanders were raising glasses in a Heil Hitler toast. Occasionally, one of the Nazis would make an angry statement about the Americans or the Maquis. As Ortiz listened to the comments, his anger grew. He departed from the eatery in stealth. Nonetheless, he came back a short while after. He threw off his cloak and brandished two .38 caliber arms, confronting the hostile troops. "We've been raising glasses to Hitler throughout the night," he commented. "Allow me to propose an alternative toast now. Salutations, Mr. President of the USA." The Germans, taken aback, gave in to Ortiz's requests. "Now let us raise a glass to the United States Marine Corps," the captain of the Marines announced. Then the towering, good-looking Leatherneck marched briskly to the door and vanished into the darkness. During Operation Union, Ortiz conducted multiple daring actions. Over time, he would earn membership in the British Empire's most honourable order. According to his citation, this officer spent 4 months helping the Maquis organize in a particularly dangerous department, where their members were under continual attack. He also took great risks to protect 4 RAF officers who had been captured in the area and escorted them to the Spanish border. In his pursuit of these officers' freedom, he broke into a German military garage, stole 10 Gestapo motors and put them to good use. Despite being known to the enemy, he obtained a Gestapo pass for personal use. The French, as Thackwait and his colleagues found out, were ready to battle but severely underprepared. A scarcity of funds was another issue. As soon as word got out, though, the men of Operation Union set out to train the rebel group. With each passing month, the Maquis became better and began attacking the Germans in the area more frequently. The once friendly Haute-Savoie territory was no longer safe due to these relentless attempts. 3 German panzer battalions attacked the Vercors region in February. Despite their lack of weaponry, the Maquis fought the Nazis with remarkable skill. As a result, the Germans had little choice but to send 2 divisions of assault soldiers to try to cut off the plateau. The OSS and British intelligence quickly realized that the French underground would require massive supplies if it was to have any success against the Germans. The Union troops had been withdrawn by the end of May. Normandy was invaded by the Allies the week after that. Everyone, including the Germans, recognized that the time had come to liberate occupied France. La Chapelle-en-Vercors was bombarded in the middle of July. The beleaguered Maquis received 1,500 canisters of weapons, ammo, and other supplies from American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft on July 14th. The Germans started bombing and strafing the town 30 minutes after the residents fled out into the streets, shouting and waving to the flyers. The men were unable to retrieve the containers because of this. The only time they could collect 200 of them was throughout the night. As residents rushed to flee their burning homes in search of safety, enemy soldiers opened fire on them using machine guns. The Germans launched a glider assault on Vercors, Almost 7 days after that,
Classes are limited to
the
less
town
than a
was
dozen
captured
men,
by the
thus
extremist
ensuring the
Waffen-SS
utmost security
troopers
and
who
providing
led the
almost
assault.
individual instruction for
The
each
Marquis
student.
launched 4 separate counterattacks against the Nazis, each time being pushed back. Horrific casualties were suffered by the resistance forces due to the lack of air or artillery support. The Germans started murdering defenseless people in retaliation. The Haute-Savoie scenario was becoming worse. The decision was made to airdrop further supplies to the Marquis. Newly promoted to the rank of Major, Ortiz would also be in charge of leading the subsequent unit into enemy territory. On a bright June Sunday in 1944, Marine Sergeant Jack Reisler and a few companions would frequently use their 48-hour pass to visit Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. There, soapbox orators would deliver impassioned speeches on anything from the impending doom of humanity to anti-government propaganda. Out of nowhere, the Marines heard someone behind them ask, "What are you all up to?" When they turned around, Peter Ortiz was staring back at them. The Marine officer had just returned from Union. He informed the group that he was going back. Reisler and his friends were eager to join Ortiz, who told them to be patient, and he would find out if they could accompany him. After serving as an instructor at Parachute School in New River, North Carolina, and then at Riggers School in Lakehurst, New Jersey, Reisler asked to be transferred since he was bored with both of these posts. Eventually, the Marine NCO found himself summoned to his commanding officer's office and asked if he wanted to do something different. The eager NCO consented without hesitation. Following this, he was dispatched to the Congressional Country Club in Washington, D.C., which had been taken over by the OSS during the war to serve as a school for its operatives. The course director was the former Shanghai, China police chief, British Major William "Dangerous Dan" Fairbairn. The career of Fairbairn had been full of colour. The Fairbairn stiletto, a real fine knife, according to one OSS operative, was one of his numerous military achievements. Fairbairn taught us judo, Reisler recalled. In terms of age, he was 45. He would invite you to come after him while offering you one of his stilettos. We were careful not to injure him. But when he finished with you, you'd be staring up at the sky. After a successful completion of training in Washington, D.C., the 16 agents, 8 Marines and 8 soldiers, were dispatched to England and quartered at Dunham House in Altrincham, south of Manchester, for further instruction. The British jumping style was taught to them here. Parachutes made in the United States were distinct from those made in Britain. While the risers and suspension lines emerged first in the American chute, the canopy was the last item to come out of the British chute. 3 snaps, one on the chest and one on each leg, were also standard on American chutes. While Americans jumped from the plane's side, Brits dove from a hole in the plane's underbelly. The English way of jumping was preferred by the majority of American servicemen. There was less of an initial shock for the British, and the parachutist was able to exit his chute far faster. The 3 8-inch cable used for the static line instead of webbing was the one negative aspect of the British version. One had to use extreme caution that the cable entangles someone's limbs, which could lead to a fatal accident for the jumper. Reisler was called to Kensington Palace Mansions a few days following his encounter with Ortiz. Despite being chosen for Operation Union 2, he was vaguely aware of its specifics. Meeting in Baker Street, the headquarters of British intelligence, Ortiz, Reisler, U.S. Air Force Captain John Coolidge, Gunnery Sergeant Robert LaSalle, Sergeants Charles Perry, John Baudner, and Fred Fritz Brunner convened. In France, the operatives would be joined by Joseph Arcelin, a member of the French resistance who went by the moniker Jojo. A mountain pack, personal items, a map case, a Winchester semi-automatic rifle with a metal folding stock, a Colt 45 automatic pistol, and a Fairbairn stiletto were supplied to the men at Baker Street. Nettishall Airfield, located around 60 miles northeast of London, was the next stop for the party. They were presented with a silver hip flask containing cognac, a pack of unmarked Lucky Strike cigarettes, and the French francs equivalent to $1,000. Additionally, Ortiz received a bag containing 1 million francs to be utilized in supporting the Maquis. Finally, the agents were briefed on their mission. The purpose of Union 2 was not only to train the Maquis, but also to be in direct contact with German troops. In addition, Allied planes were to drop 864 containers of supplies to the French underground in the Vercors plateau area on August 1st. The containers held 1,096 Sten guns, nearly 300 Bren automatic rifles, 1,350 Lee Enfield rifles, over 2,000 Mills anti-personnel grenades, more than 1,000 Gammon grenades, 260 pistols, 51 Piat anti-tank weapons, over 2 million rounds of ammunition, several tons of explosives, medical supplies, clothing, and food. This drop would equal the one parachuted in on July 14th, just 2.5 weeks earlier. These were the two biggest parachute supply drops of the war. A fighter escort of North American P-51 Mustangs accompanied the B-17S of the 388th Heavy Bomber Group as they lifted off from Nettishall Airfield on Tuesday morning, August 1st, carrying the soldiers of Union 2. The planes were painted black. The drop zone would shortly be crossed by 78 planes. Between the plateaus d'Aiglière and Vercors, at a height of 400 feet, the containers and agents leaped at 60-second intervals. Upon reaching the ground safely, the troops were met by a company of Maquis. A member of the French resistance approached Rissler as he was gathering his chute and kissed him on both cheeks. Unfortunately, disaster occurred right when the operation began. Sergeant Charles Perry fell to his death because his chute wouldn't open. He met an untimely end when the static line snapped due to a malfunction. Gunnery Sergeant Robert LaSalle also suffered injuries to his back and ribs from the incident. The Maquis quickly gathered the weapons and supplies. Residents of neighboring Albertville told the Germans that 2 battalions of American paratroopers had landed in an effort to throw them off their game. Thanks to that false information, the members of Union 2 were able to avoid capture. Following Perry's complete military funeral rites, Ortiz and his men began training the Maquis Boulet Battalion. A local Maquis hero, Captain Jean Boulle, was the inspiration for the unit's name. Disaster almost struck again when one young Frenchman picked up a Sten gun and began firing wildly in all directions. As bullets whizzed around, everyone dove for cover. Luckily, no one was injured. However, the unfortunate resistance fighter did shoot his own toe off in the accident. The party under Ortiz started patrolling the region after a week of getting to know the weaponry. The cunning Marine would often choose a bend in the road or a nearby elevation to set up Maquis ambushes. He would hide while the different German divisions passed, keeping track of the number of vehicles, soldiers, etc., as he had committed their names to memory. Ortiz decided to use the Maquis to expel the Nazis from the Tartanese Valley after consulting with them on August 12th. A little village named Montgiraud was reached a few days later by Union 2 with the help of a small number of Maquis. Due to a small German spotter jet flying overhead, the squad was understandably anxious. Captain Bull had approximately 200 soldiers ready to fight close by. German mortars started hitting their positions in the early afternoon. It was determined to draw back as the bombardment accelerated. Despite the evacuation of some wounded resistance fighters, the town church was left with 2 more severely wounded Maquisards. In order to avoid being cut off by the German forces, the withdrawing Marines fled to the steep hills surrounding the settlement. The German patrols, on foot and motorcycles, came within 30 to 40 feet, Rissler recalled, but their singing made them easy to spot, so we knew they were coming. Centron was our destination after we crossed the Isère River. By the time we paused to rest at midnight, another German patrol had passed by. They had the region largely encircled. None of us moved. They simply passed us by, oblivious to our presence. At the same time, the Nazis found the 2 injured Maquis at Montgiraud. Shortly after, They were shot and the church burned to the ground. As a form of reprisal, the adversaries started to gather captives. The Germans were still evading Union 2. The group of operatives was positioned just outside of Longfoy on the morning of August 15th. While making his way to the village, Ortiz told the group to remain hidden. Ortiz contacted the mayor and informed him of the group's delicate situation. Before heading back to the hamlet to feed and shelter for the night, he reunited with the rest of the company. Returning to Centron, the men of Union 2 set out the following morning. Arkelin, Ortiz, Bodnar, Rissler, Coolidge, Brunner, and they all crossed the bridge at the same time. Out of nowhere, a German armored patrol came around a bend and spotted the group in the open. Despite Coolidge's leg injury, he and Brunner were able to escape to the river, while the agents attempted to flee. While attempting to take cover in an apple orchard, Arkelin was apprehended. Bodnar, Ortiz and Rissler dashed back to Centron. They were absorbing the brunt of the German fire as they dashed from house to house. As Rissler attempted to make his way to safety through a drainage pipe, his rucksack was filled with bullet holes. Thankfully, he did not sustain any injuries. The German infantrymen had shifted their focus to Ortiz's little group. If the Marines would just surrender, the Centron residents could have avoided German retaliation. Ortiz would later write, "Since the Gestapo knew all about Mission Union and its history, there was no hope that we could be treated like ordinary prisoners of war." This was written years after the fact. Personally, I did not find it too difficult to decide to surrender. For a long time I engaged in risky pursuits, and I was ready for my number to be called. I briefed Sergeant Bodnar on the issue and my plans while he stood beside me. "Major, we are Marines. What you think is right goes for me too," he said, fixing his gaze on me firmly. Ortiz hollered out to the Germans to cease their firing. He fearlessly made his way to the street as soon as the wind died down. As a last line of defense, an elderly Frenchwoman dashed at Ortiz and placed herself in front of him. The Marine major silently pushed her aside and continued to advance toward the enemy lines, machine gun bullets kicking up dust around him. Speaking in German, Ortiz outlined the conditions under which his forces would capitulate: the absence of retaliation against the populace. They were innocent, Ortiz said. His party was just passing through. He had not offered them any assistance. Ortiz had his soldiers stand by the side of the road as soon as the German officer signed off on the conditions. He continued by instructing them to withhold all information save their names, ranks, and service numbers. Since Arkelin was already taken prisoner, he was led forward to join the others. He had assumed the identity of George Anderson, a Marine, and donned Perry's outfit. Even though Arkelin was completely illiterate in English, the ruse nonetheless succeeded. But the commanding German officer was very irritated to hear that a battalion had been repelled by only 4 men armed with 45 S and carbines. Enraged, the opposing soldiers combed the other buildings for reinforcements, only to discover that this constituted the whole contingent. Ortiz's group was then transported to German headquarters at Bourg Saint-Maurice. Everyone claimed they were paratroopers who had jumped as a part of Operation Anvil, the invasion of southern France. Once again the ruse was successful, and the adversary even showed greater deference to the party. Major Kolb, an Iron Cross recipient from World War I, was thereafter presented with the Marines, among them being Jojo Arkelin. Despite knowing the identities of his captives, Kolb refused to surrender his prize catch to the Gestapo for some inexplicable reason. He quickly proved that he knew a great deal about me, Ortiz later wrote. In great detail and accurately he described our air operation, the burial ceremony for Sergeant Perry, various engagements and the manner and position of our movements since leaving Montgiraud. These, he said, had been reported by a shepherd who was one of his field agents. No time was wasted in removing the Union 2 troops from harm's way in case the Maquis tried to free them. On top of that, The Allies' Operation Anvil forces were only 15 miles distant. Ortiz requested an audience with Commanding General Karl Pflaum upon his arrival in Chambry. The anxious Marine Major stormed into Pflaum's office after his request was approved, demanding that the 157th Alpine Division capitulate to Union II. Pflaum blew his stack and ordered Ortiz to leave his office before ordering him to be shot. Obviously, the capitulation never happened. Malag-Milag Nord, a naval prison camp located in the small German village of Westertimke, not far from Bremen, had detained the captured Marines by the end of September 1944. There were a total of 13 Americans among the camp's inmates, the majority of whom were British sailors and Royal Marines. Near Westertimke, fighting broke out shortly after the Allies advanced toward Berlin in 1945. Knowing that Allied forces would be afraid to fire straight into the camp compound due to concerns about friendly losses, Waffen-SS troops strategically deployed artillery pieces within. The inmates dug foxholes so they wouldn't get hurt. Arkelin was wounded by shrapnel despite burrowing in for safety. Thankfully, his injuries were not considered life-threatening. Malag-Milag Nord was finally liberated on April 29, 1945, by the British 7th Guards Armoured Division. A British naval officer attached to the Royal Marines was approached by Ortiz, who insisted that he wanted to join his unit in order to bag a few more Germans before hunting season closed. Despite the officer's gratitude, the prisoners of war were ordered to board trucks and taken to the rear area where bagpipes could be heard. Ortiz was presented with his second Navy Cross in recognition of his exceptional gallantry. During the Union II operation, Rissler, Bodner and LaSalle were awarded the Silver Star for their valor. Unfortunately, not all brave Allies made it out alive. An earlier mission resulted in the death of Fritz Brunner, who had escaped from Saint-Tron, according to Rissler. Dead at the hands of the Germans was Captain Jean Boulle. Instead of surrendering when he asked for it under a truce flag, they opened fire on him as he entered Albertville. They knelt him down and shot him behind the head. Instead of viewing him as a regular soldier, the Germans saw him as a terrorist. James Cagney and Richard Conte starred in a post-war Hollywood film called 13 Rue Madeleine. The French Missions Union and Union II served as inspiration for the film. The film's technical advisor was Ortiz. The protagonist of Union and Union II lost his battle with illness in 1988. In the OSS, he was truly legendary. To mark the 40th anniversary of Union II and the epic parachute drop, Jack Rissler and John Bodner went back to France in May 1984. They paid their respects to Charles Perry's grave. A bronze plaque was put at his grave by the thankful inhabitants of Albertville, who also hold a memorial service every year in his honor. Upon their return to the Haute-Savoie region, the townsfolk greeted Rissler and Bodnar as heroes. Long ago, the French people had given their lives to end the Nazi dictatorship. They had not forgotten their sacrifices. "We were wined and dined," said Rissler. "It was a good feeling." For more secret stories of cunning, endurance and iron resolve, subscribe to The Shadows and the Past.